All right, we're in. I'm Adam Tischler.
I'm Matt Jones.
Hey, this is the USA SUP podcast, second edition. Last one was pretty fun, Matt. Got some good feedback, too. Thanks, everyone, for the comments on Facebook. People, on YouTube as well. Honestly, YouTube's better because then everybody can see it. I got a whole bunch of stuff on Facebook and like a local paddling group here in Seattle. I don't know, Matt, if you got any feedback, but we heard it. It was a lot of really good input.
Yeah, mostly biased friends who could be putting out terrible things, and they tell me I did a good job anyway. So we need worse friends to get more realistic feedback, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
I will tell you one of the big things. We got to get at this later at some point because there's so much to discuss in this topic, but the drafting concept that we covered, some of the craftiness that was going on, that's definitely a topic for a future podcast.
We could do a whole thing on that. But we did get some comments about the ups and downs and should drafting be allowed, and if so, who can you draft, who can't you draft? So a discussion for another time. But it was cool to see our chat starting other discussions about stuff. Absolutely.
I got to tell you, speaking of drafting, I paddled this morning and I definitely practiced my drafting. I've been traveling a lot for work. My fitness is not where I'd like it to be. Thank goodness I have friends who are slightly faster than me to make my my Garmin times look
that's
like
right.
I'm doing better work than I am.
You guys have the unofficial bridge to bridge race series going in Seattle right now?
Yeah, it's a 5K. And the last 2 weeks have been beautiful. It's cold, starts in the 30s, upper 30s, but low wind, sun. It's been great.
Dang. I missed those. And all on South Lake Union there. It's a beautiful spot to paddle.
Yeah, right in the cut, actually, which is great.
Okay.
Although for the second week in a row, we cut off a bunch of rowers right at the opening of the cut as we were making our turn.
They're super maneuverable in an 8-person rowing shell, right? They'll figure it out.
It's like 40-foot wide area. Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, enough about that. How's your paddling life going so far? This early winter.
I'm still, Seattle is fresh in my mind. So every time I'm like, it's a little chilly and it's like 65 degrees, I think of you guys freezing your butt off. So it's great here. My mind is already starting to think about Carolina Cup next spring. So kind of getting my gears and my shit in order to go get my training together for the next few months. And the winter winds here are a blast, and you can go downwind and it's 60 degrees most of the winter and can't complain. It's been beautiful.
Sweet. Hey, speaking of fall paddling conditions, and they're different everywhere, as we know, one of the places where fall paddling conditions are phenomenal is in SoCal. And some big news, USA SUP members who get our newsletter, which is all the USA SUP members, have already been told that we are planning a national championship coming up here in a year, essentially just over a little under a year from now, November 11th in SoCal, likely kind of targeting the LA County, Orange County border there, Long Beach, Seal Beach area. Really excited about it. We're aware that the ICF has announced there will be a November World Championship in Thailand. Don't know what the date is. We're just keeping our fingers crossed that they work out okay. But from a USA SUP perspective, we feel like the time is now to start having an organized national championship. So much more to come on that. We'll probably have a full podcast on that at some point once the details emerge. But really excited to announce that. It's overdue. We've sort of relied on races like Carolina Cup or others to say that's the proxy national championship. And but we know it isn't. Those are different kind of races, and I think having one that has some of the attributes that people are slowly coalescing around is going to be really, really beneficial. So, what are attributes that people are coalescing around? What's a distance race? What's a tech race? We're going to get to that in 1 minute. First, a public service announcement for race directors in the United States. You guys are already typically gathering board length, which is 14 or under, or that kind of thing. One thing you can do is we are getting ready to launch our rankings and really kind of have them up and running for sure next year, if not retroactively later this year, is to gather what state people are from and age, essentially. Those are two things that will help us stack our rankings up. So little PSA for you. Now, let's get back to the race attributes. Matt, you and I have been talking a lot about this. I don't have. I was going to build like a PowerPoint about like the scoring stuff for how do you mark a tech race. But let's just start with you. I'm curious for your thoughts.
Well, I mean, a lot of things come to mind, right? Like tech race, wherever you go, can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I think we covered the Busan APP distance race in our last episode, but really that looked like a tech race just kind of stretched out, right? Like it had 7 or 8 buoy turns of various different directions over a course of 10K. Now, if you shrink that down to a 1 mile race, you have basically exactly what the ICF has run as their tech race final in the last couple of years. So yeah, you and I got to discussing what does tech race really mean? How do you differentiate it from a sprint race versus a distance race? How do you make sure it's fair? On the other end, we have the ICF tech race and the ISA tech race. They're really different looking. Well, how do you train for one? If you go to one event locally and you say it's a tech race, what is it going to look like, right? Like there seems to be no standardization. So we're a little confused.
Yeah. So we had I'll call it a webcast of sorts. It was actually a call in for USA SUP members, and we had a lot of really good informed paddlers, and many of them are also race directors locally. And this topic came up, and I don't know how we hadn't stumbled upon this concept before, but one of the things that emerged is a really cool idea, and I'm going to ask everyone to bear with me. This is the thing I wanted to make a PowerPoint chart for, but no time. Maybe I'll make one up and put it in post. Fingers crossed. If you don't see it, you know that I was too busy. Okay, but let's go like this. So the way that you would be able to inform a potential racer is by essentially a point system. Not a point system that determines who wins or anything like that, but essentially a point system that declares like, hey, this is the technicality of a race. I'll give you an example. You would assign points to different turns or different technical aspects. So as one example, maybe a 4-point turn would be something over 90 degrees where there are breaking waves, white water of some sort, right? That's a hefty kind of thing to deal with. A 3-point turn might be something like a 90 to 180 degree turn. 2-point could be less than 90, et cetera. 1 point, you name it, maybe it's 45 degrees to 90 degrees, et cetera. Now you begin to say, okay, well, how does this wrap up? Well, you kind of get a sense of what the distance is. And if you say it's 5K and the thing has, I don't know, I'll make it up, 35 points, you know that there's going to be a lot of turning. It's going to be pretty tricky. If you see a race as 5K and it's got 15 points, you go, okay, maybe manageable. You see a race as 5K and it's got 3 points, you know it's an out and back essentially to some point. And so as a paddler, you begin to go, and we hear this all the time, and as a paddle director, race director, this is one of the questions you get. People are kind of going, they're bringing 2 boards. They don't know what the course is going to be. And so I think that having that kind of clarity where you look at a thing and you see a mess of points, you know that somewhere in there's a lot of technical stuff to be done. You see very few points and you go, okay, not that much to be done. And then, Matt, to the conclusion here is you start going, what's a tech race? Well, maybe we figure out how many points over what distance is the tech race.
Sure. Yeah. It's if you sit something over X amount of number of points, it now qualifies for a tech race, right? And I think a good example that comes to mind, and I know I throw the Goat Boater guys out here as an example just because Rob and Megan are friends and they are local to me, but they had their first race of the season was a 5K. You go out, you kind of gently turn around an island, you hit a buoy, you 180, and you come back, you gently come around that same island, and you finish, right? It was an on-water start and a beach run finish. So maybe that beach run gives you an extra point or two towards a technical, right? But I wouldn't call that a technical race personally, right?
Yeah.
Their last race of the season has a beach start. I think it had 22 buoy turns over the course of 4 miles and change of various angles or whatever like that. They've got a boat zipping by up and back to throw waves.
Diabolical.
Just to throw a wrench in the system, right? But to me, that adds an element of technicality. And it's a 3-lap thing, and every lap you have to do a beach run through a little chicane.
Yeah.
That adds a lot more technicality, right? So even if they are roughly the same distance, 3.2 miles to 4 miles, right? You're kind of splitting hairs on distance. What you're asking of a racer is really different.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that's this point system. Obviously, we haven't ironed out exactly what attributes count as what and how many points makes a tech race and what doesn't. But we feel like there's got to be a way to kind of iron this out a little bit to say that's a tech race and that's not.
Yeah, and I think the other important thing here, too, is, a lot of times on race day, certainly here in Puget Sound, the race director has to make decisions about the course. But if you've advertised a 30-point course, let's just call it, because you described 2 courses. One strikes me as being probably 5 or 6 points, the first one. The second one, something between 40 and 50 points. Hefty.
Sure.
If you've described a race that's going to be 20 points, roughly, to racers, and they show up, and now you've got to change the course because of wind direction, as a race director, it lets you start going, you know what, I know I need to get to 20 points. So I'm going to, that's sort of what I've got to do. And if I'm doing turns in protected areas where once they were going to be in a different spot, but it's going to be too spicy, it gives everyone the ability to really kind of have a predictable race for participants, which is one of the things that we're really focused on in USA SUP, which is how do we get it so that you can jump on a plane, maybe you've got a borrowed board set up, and show up from Seattle to South Carolina for a 25-point race and not get totally thrown off when they're like, well, the wind came up, so now it's a 3-point race. And you're going, not what I thought was going to happen.
Right. You're on a board that's 2 or 3 inches wider than what you were planning on because you were planning on whipping some buoy turns and doing a beach run. And yeah, now if it's an out and back, you probably still have fun, right? But you aren't getting what you bargained for one way or another.
Yeah. No, and we've talked a lot about it. Much more to come on this topic. Again, want your folks' thoughts. I think, there's going to be people who are like, no, it's all about the water. What's going on in the day. Totally get it. And there's going to be people who I think are going to be like, yes, this is what we've been waiting for. I will tell you, I'm firmly in the camp of standardization for expectations, not necessarily for the platform per se. Like I like that we race in different kinds of water, which we're going to talk about in a little bit here. But I think that being able to tell a participant what they're showing up for, this is just as good, by the way, for the people who have a quiver of boards as it is for a new person who could be showing up going, hey, listen, I'm going to go, for what I'm comfortable is in out and back. Not comfortable in buoy turns, not comfortable in traffic. And they might see that like, hey, the long race on any given day, the distance race is a minimum number of turns, right? It's a 3-point day, right?
Sure.
180 turn, boom, and come back. And they might feel more comfortable doing a 10 plus K event than they would a much shorter event with, 25, 35 points of turns and various technical stuff attributed to it. And I think that that's a benefit too for experienced and amateur racers. A lot more amateur. We're all amateurs. Experienced and not so experienced racers.
Yes. We need amateur tattooed on my forehead here. I'm totally with you.
Yeah, no, I was going to say the font at the bottom should be amateur here and the experience there, but
yeah, but I think your point is a good one, right? That like it benefits everyone, and the other end of standardization is we have this point system, but a 20-point race near you doesn't look like a 20-point race near me. So you still have variation in what's happening that gives the flavor to our sport that we want, right?
Yeah, one of the places it's less fun to fall in.
Right.
I'll give you a hint. It's where I live.
Yes. One of us is wearing a sweater. One of us is wearing a T-shirt. That's
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Sunny here, though. I will say that.
That's good.
Hey, so let's talk more tech race. You have. I'm going to pull up a video file, and I want you to talk to it. This is the ICF 2021 Tech Final for the women. And you had some thoughts around how this thing was going to get run.
Their course is roughly a mile, and the ICF has a standardized, if you have this many left turns, you have to have that many plus or minus one of the other direction turn.
Yeah.
Right? Granted, they're in much more controlled, flat condition water here. But the same rules apply when you're not. So this was in 2021. And then the following year in 2022, they run it in and out through the beach.
Yeah, so I'm going to let this thing rip here real quick.
Yeah,
you can watch it as you're going.
Yeah, so you'll see like they have like an opening 200 meters or so to their first buoy, and then more or less zigzag their way back.
Yeah, I want to point out too, as you see them get to the first buoy. We talked about this in our last podcast, and there's a lot to go on here. But again, that sort of golden buoy concept where first person in kind of has massive control is sort of how this event works.
Yeah, and April, I believe, we all know she's a really strong sprinter, right? She just won ISA gold in the 200 meters, so she comes out hammering, and spoiler alert, does not win this race, but does win to the first buoy. But I think that's where you see the actual test of more technical skills, is because you're demanding people to turn a certain number of times and both directions, your margin for error shrinks quite drastically.
Right. Okay, so I'm pulling up now. You made the point. You were making the point around equal number of turns, and I think that is a very big deal. And as a lefty, who's stronger making, I'll say, right shoulder turns for me.
So you're goofy-footed. You're left foot in the back.
Goofy-footed. Yeah,
Got it.
Goofy-footed. And it's like most race directors who are also racing, and this is a lot of folks, I mean, until you get to a very high level, are like, to spill the race, they're like, yeah, that's better. That'll work for most people. That's what you do.
Yeah.
But then for the folks who aren't them, you wind up with goofy footers in most cases, kind of get hosed.
Sure.
So that's the concept anyways.
By testing everything, it shines a light on your weaknesses, right? If you're testing 10 different attributes and you crush it in 9, that last one, you're going to notice, and everybody else is probably going to notice too, hey, that's the one thing that maybe kept them from winning that race, right?
Yep.
Whereas the other person knocked it out of the park in all 10 things that were tested in whatever race it might be. So yeah, the ISA technical here in Puerto Rico, all of the turns are left-hand turns, except for this one buoy in the middle. And it's roughly an M course that they're doing in and out through the surf here. And Candace, I believe, is regular-footed. And let me go out on like a disclaimer here and say, I'm not saying Candace wouldn't have won if this course were run the other way. She clearly knows what she's doing and can turn whichever way she wants to turn.
Yeah.
But on this one turn, that's a right-hand turn in the middle of the M, she was noticeably slower around the turn. My hunch is that because she has to do it toe side, she does not step back on her board and just kind of does a crossbow turn here. And it's slow, right? If there's somebody right against her who is goofy-footed and can backside turn that, they maybe squeak by her. She had a big lead. She's playing it smart. But it stands to be like an interesting hypothetical. If this course were run in the opposite direction and she had to do all of the other turns on maybe the side that she's not quite as comfortable on, would it have looked different?
Yeah, totally agree. And let's be clear, Candace is very capable of doing a step back turn here and all that, like you were saying.
Yes.
But what you're pointing out is here she just sort of exposes like, yeah, I can do it, but I'm not going to if I'm not under pressure. And like she got this thing locked away way early, and we're going to get to that in a minute.
Yeah.
Totally agree, though. Races, the M style is great for spectators. Everybody knows that. It's one of the reasons why that race course is popular. Because you can kind of see the action coming and going. Competitors can see each other coming and going. There's a lot of benefit to it. And you can really sort of avoid cross traffic, meaning a figure eight kind of traffic incident, which is a big deal when you're doing race directing, because you don't want back markers sort of on a collision path with your race leaders and vice versa. So, yeah, that's a big deal. What's the easy way to remedy that?
You standardize how many turns you have in each direction, right? Granted, that kind of knocks out an M course, unless you have to like do one lap and then 180 and do it back the other direction. It could be a little tricky. You could end up with some traffic jams like you talk about. But to me, like it's not testing everything super fairly, though you could take the other end of this and say, this is the course. It was made public well in advance. It's up to the athlete to prepare appropriately, right? Which leads me into a really interesting thing that I've noticed is working with elite youth athletes for the last dozen or so years.
Yeah. Hey, give us the background on that real quick, because we haven't introduced that aspect of your athletic life.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I've been a competitive rock climbing coach for the last dozen years, where I do work with some adult athletes, but for the most part, at least until now, I've been working with elite kids who are traveling all over the country, qualifying for nationals, Team USA,
Olympic bound.
Hopefully some, yeah.
Yep.
From ages 8 to 20-ish. It's a full-time thing. These kids all train like professional athletes, just like you would see in a gymnastics gym, right, where kids are there 20, 30, 40 hours a week to train and accomplish their goals. So, yeah, I've gotten a front row seat to a lot of interesting development processes and really, really amazing athletes. So what you see a lot of times is when a sport starts to evolve, these younger kids start to garner skill sets that the older generations don't have, because the only way they can compete is by finding new ways to do something, because they're not going to outmuscle somebody who's 3, 4, 5, 10 years their senior, who's been training really hard that whole time, right? And we saw that years ago when Connor came into the sport. There were guys who were bigger, stronger, fitter than he was, but he could just run up and down his board and found different ways to paddle and was the first guy to start doing choke stroke things and could ride a narrower board, and the list goes on, right?
Right.
But so what I noticed in this last race was Shrimpy's doing something that you've probably heard me go on and on about this, as many of my friends have, is he backside turns every turn. So if it's a left-hand turn, he lines up like a regular footer with his right foot back, and backside turns. If it's a left-hand turn, he lines up like a goofy footer with his left foot back and backside turns. In my opinion, that's the way to go. You have a lot more power. You can really whip your board around. I know that there are guys and girls who can do it without this, right? You look at Connor do a toe side turn. It's beautiful. It's a thing of art, right? It's amazing. But most of us can't do that kind of stuff. And it's a really hard skill set to get. My hunch is that most people do that because they come from a surf background where they're very used to stepping back with one foot more so than the other. But if you start early and start practicing a new skill, learning to backside turn both things, I think, is going to make people faster in and out of buoys. And you're starting to see a little bit of that now. Yeah,
it's going to be table stakes, isn't it?
I think so. Right? Like, Shrimpy's not going to... I should take that back. In the past, he was not going to out-sprint or anybody into or out of a buoy. Now, he probably can. But when you watch him race, at least to me, he's the most comfortable guy on his board. He never falls. He never bobbles. It doesn't even look like he's gonna fall. He just is comfortable, man. And all of his turns are so clean and so confident. And I do think that him doing a heel or a backside turn every time he turns plays at least a pretty large part in that.
Yeah. So I agree. In fact, I try to do when I can. I've tried to do that too, just in my training. Partly because on any other board sport, I'm regular footed. It's my hand dominance that makes me goofy
interesting.
On the paddleboard. Yeah, it's really weird. It's not ideal.
Right.
It actually winds up meaning that I'm not good at either way.
And that's the thing, right? Like, it is asking a lot of people to, like, just learning to cross step to the back of your board and do a confident buoy turn on your dominant side is hard enough for most people, right? Like, it becomes kind of a labored shuffle, especially if you had to paddle any level of distance to or from a buoy to get to that turn. You're tired and your legs feel like jelly, and what maybe felt beautiful in practice on your own now looks terrible when you start walking to the back of the board. And we've all been there, right? So to ask somebody like, hey, now you got to learn to do it on your opposite side is a big ask athletically. Mm-hmm. But for the elites, especially the young elites, I think we're going to start to see, whether it's this or other things, a whole new skill set and level of skills start to come through, which is going to be really interesting to me. And I think we started to really see that at the ISA, where some of our younger athletes are kind of coming of age, so to speak.
Yeah, is your theory kind of essentially saying we're going to have to pull the ladder up from the older generation, as it were? I don't know how you would define older, but that you install these rules and essentially say, like, hey, figure it out, or like you're never going to beat Shrimpy, period.
Well, yes and no, right? I think that's kind of how sports evolve, right? Is that you have a goal and the level always goes up, right? And ideally, our elite older athletes are teaching our up and coming athletes tricks and tips, right? Like talking with Bodie a little bit. He spent last winter going down to Southern California, racing with the guys down there. And he made a point to spend some time with Danny Ching, who is crazy that he's like the oldest elite guy, especially in the States, right? Like he's in his late 30s. I don't know exactly how old he is, but he's like an old elite racer, right? So for him to take time with Bodie and say, hey, here are things that I've noticed. Here are things I think you should work on. Here's things to think about, right? Like that's just going to accelerate the rate of progression of a 15-year-old who already can hold his own on the elite stage, right?
Right.
And that's how sports evolve. So are we pulling the rug out from under the older athletes? Yes and no, but I think that's kind of the way of the world, right? And if we want the sport to move forward, I think that all of the older athletes would be totally okay with that if you asked them about it.
Yeah, and look, he just said it. There's exceptional athletes. I mean, like, do you think Danny Ching's going to lose a technical race because someone's doing a better, offside turn than him? Maybe not. You think Candace is going to lose because someone's doing a better back? Like, there are elements of elite performance that that never really ages.
Right.
Of course,
and
it
that's
does
kind of
eventually.
the catch-22 with like skill acquisition, right? Is that like Danny has like a really amazing toe side turn that he does now, right? It would be easier for him than you or me to go back and learn a new skill, but he's already got this skill that's really good. So even if, I have spent the last couple seasons, so now I do all my turns backside again, but even though I'm better backside than I am toe side, it's still worse than Danny's toe side turn. Right. So I don't think they're in danger of like somebody finding this new skill that's all of a sudden going to like dethrone them off their like older elite level, but it will for the people where it's like already nipping at their heels, who can find that extra 1 or 2% to kind of even the playing field a little bit.
Well, and listen, I think that there's actually just maybe the final thought on the buoy turn stuff, but I think that there's an argument to be made that you actually need a toe side and a backside turn, particularly if you and I get our way and buoys continue to be contested atmosphere, that you might get pinched in such a way that you need to do like the Connor toe side turn. Or you might get pinched in such a way that you have to do a backside turn. I think that is one of the exciting things that can emerge when you have contested buoy turns. That's where you see that kind of progression.
I think one of the most interesting things I've heard about that kind of thing is like elite athletes have more ways to problem solve than normal folks, right? And a great example is golf. I've played like 2 rounds of golf in my whole life, right? So if I line up and I don't even know golf terminology. I
don't think it's line up.
Got my 5-iron, and I'm trying to not end up in the sand bunker. Yeah. There we go. Golf. And I have like one possible sequence of events for me to hit the ball straight, right? It's got to be exactly perfect. And if I don't, that sucker's going in the sand. Tiger Woods has a whole bunch of different ways that from here to here of like different muscle activations and different sequence of events that he can be like, and make adjustments on the fly and still have the outcome that he wants, right? So to your point, I think, the more ways you can buoy turn, the better athlete you're going to become, right? And that's where you'll see it's play becomes practice, right? You see a lot of those pro athletes whipping turns, the nose is above their head, doing stalls, toe side, backside, turning 360 on their board. It's not that they need that in a race, but it makes you have to problem solve and come up with new ways to do the thing by accident. Yeah,
right? If you follow Erie Tenario on his Instagram account, he probably is the greatest of the SUP Radio Cowboys on that social media channel.
He should start a channel called SUP Rodeo or something. He's incredible, right? Like, yeah. I don't know if he has like maybe you're saying he's got like a background in acrobatics or gymnastics and something. I think like he does, yeah. It shows, right? Like, yep. And because of that, he's got more ways to problem solve, whether it's in and out through the surf or at a turn, or when things get hairy, he's got more ways to figure it out than the rest of us do.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, I'm going to play next item for discussion. That's if you grew up in DC, which you did and I did. You probably never watched the McLaughlin Group, did you?
No.
Next topic.
All right. No, I don't even know what that is.
That's that whole political show that was a local show in D.C. for a while and then went national. All right, here we go. Let's talk about the other thing we noticed from the ISAs, and that is waves. Waves. This is a big one. Mike Euchre and Chris Parker covered this really well recently. Mike had some great comments too. Waves were an absolute discriminator. And here you see the race was essentially half over early on in the SUP Tech race for the men. And they're shrimpy, and I can't remember who's on his right. Is that?
That's Noack. So this is end of the first lap. Noack and Shrimpy kind of caught a small wave into the center buoy of the M, and then coming in closest to the beach to this, we'll call it the hammer buoy, just for old time's sake, catch a wave way ahead of everybody else. So now you'll see as the video goes through, they'll kind of start to separate and have a large gap, maybe 50, 60 to 100 meters on the rest of the pack coming into the second lap. And then they catch another wave, right? So really the race is, barring a huge upset or somebody totally eats it multiple times, the race is over. Not for those two guys. They still have to duke it out between each other. But the idea that like somebody in sixth is going to come back to first is very unlikely in this format. I know that could happen at the BOP where you're in and out and there's just waves galore, right? But this is not that. There's a very few number of rideable waves, and it's mostly a paddling race. So I think, to your point, like, does it separate the race too early? Is it over? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so first of all, I love this stuff. I love watching it. It is exceptional entertainment. Here's the thought I had. I don't like it as a format for amateur competition so much. Meaning, I think it's not something that a vast majority of participants can train for, period. Even if you kind of live close to a surf break, it's just, that is hard to do. There's a minor element of danger to your stuff, but not really. I mean, like I have friends in Florida who race in and out, so they play all the time. Like it's great. But for the vast majority of people, they don't have access to like warm, mild waters with somewhat predictable mild swell. Maybe the beach you live by is just, feast or famine or whatever, but more likely than not, like you don't live near a beach, and that's a problem. And I know there's like lots of voices and it's been covered up and down, this is the history of the sport, et cetera. I would just say the sport's evolving. And I think that I like open water racing. Don't get me wrong. I do not want to get to a spot where we're going. And like the Oklahoma races that the ICF put on were really cool. Very flat water. There's a place for that. But I like the open water racing as well. And the ICF races in Poland where like the distance race just turned insane. So be it. I mean, that's just, that happens. I'm okay with all of that. What I don't like is when you know that waves are going to be splitting a race up potentially, and you're essentially saying, we're going to roll the dice, and this thing's going to be figured out by who gets lucky and who doesn't. And it's kind of like, I think a lot about like downhill skiing. Like sometimes like the sun just comes out and the ice starts to get a little softer. It stinks. It's the worst when you're watching like the best in the world just like can't, win because sun popped out at the wrong time, etc. I don't like leaving sport to chance like that. It's incredibly exciting. But here's where I go. I said I don't like it for sort of the amateur stuff. I honestly, I think this would be amazing if the professionals, and you can see this is maybe a little bit down the road, but if that's what professional racing turned into, with the people who can handle those turns, like when you see like the top 20 paddlers in the world, that is going to be a tight competition. They're all going to be on the wave or the next one after. Like that race will never be over when you've got the very, very best all together. And I can see where like something like the APP Tour becomes much more about like the conditions, and that's expected once you've sort of graduated to the elite level. I don't know. How about you? You're in a place where you can play in waves now.
Yeah, I do get to play in waves now. It's pretty great. So yeah, so just to play devil's advocate to your maybe this is an elite thing, right? Doesn't that preclude a very large percentage of people who paddle from ever being able to garner the skill set needed to become elite in that scenario? Right? Like,
well, yeah.
Most paddlers don't live in a place where they can practice that, right? They live on a lake or a river or some body of water that doesn't allow them to do that frequently or safely. So you're already shrinking the pool of people who can even have a chance to become elite. So,
agreed.
And this kind of leads us into our Olympic discussion, right? Of is this, and the ISA talked a lot about this during the live broadcast for these tech races in particular. This is their proposed format for the Olympics. If the goal, and correct me if you feel differently, I took a gander at the Olympic and IOC websites for a little while. Yeah, right. Here you can see Candace catching an early wave, and just race is over, right? If the goal of having a sport in the Olympics is to get more eyes on it and hopefully more participation in it, but this is the only format that you see in the Olympics, does it really help our sport?
Yeah, no, I would say no. And by the way, she just had such an amazing race just watching.
Dude, she had I feel bad because we threw Candace under the bus, but she crushed this race, and it was super impressive to watch. And that's the one thing we should say, waves have an element of luck, but you also make your own luck by getting out there and hammering past everybody and getting way out in front and having the opportunity to catch the first wave, right?
Yeah, but you can watch some of the close carnage that's going on here. And this is when you've got Candace, who's an exceptional athlete and has lived and trained in a place where these conditions are prevalent, I'll say. And you see people who are elite paddlers who are not able to, maybe they're not as good athletes, which you could argue is Candace, but there's also that aspect you just talked about, which is they just cannot train. They might be elite athletes, but they cannot train for that the way others can. And I think that what you're saying is really true. And if we think about accessibility for the sport more generally, it doesn't make sense at that point. If you're saying we want to grow numbers, we want it to be a sport that's accessible to people, I think about every city I've lived in, where there's populations who would really benefit from having access to time on the water, and it would not include trips to the beach or the ability to do that. Whereas, maybe 15-minute ride for 30 minutes in the water, that's doable. The idea of taking 2 hours, 3-4 hours to play around at the beach all day in conditions that you can learn in, that is not 90% of the planet, let alone this country.
Not. And I think we saw the NBA figure this out a long time ago, right? We're to get good at basketball, what do you need? Very little, right? You need a hoop and a ball. That's it. And they realized decades ago, hey, why? There's nothing genetically that precludes someone from Europe or Africa or Asia from getting really good at basketball. They just don't have access to the thing. So they started organizations and outreach groups to start building courts and have people, other players and coaches and things go over to help build the sport. There's nothing that precludes somebody who's born in the middle of Kansas from being the best paddler in the States. They just don't have access to the water, right? And now if we say, hey, the tippy top of the sport is only this thing that uses waves, they can't ever, the dream dies there. Right. Mm-hmm. But if you say, hey, there's all these other disciplines that you could also get really good at, they can say, cool, I've got a lake that I can do laps on. I've got a chance to train for a distance thing. Or I've got a lake that the two buoys are 100 meters apart. I can train for the 200-meter sprint or whatever the disciplines end up being. Right. Yeah. But it doesn't kill the dream before it ever starts.
Agreed. So, look, I think, first of all, if you haven't gone and checked out Mike and Chris's podcast, they're doing it weekly, I think, on SUP Racer. Go do that if you're interested in anything that Matt and I have talked about. It's funny, you and I started making notes about what we would talk about before life intervened weeks and weeks ago, and they essentially covered it all. They are totally tuned in. Those guys probably have forgotten more about this sport than you and I know currently.
Likely.
And just really, really great content there. I want to bring up the part. Okay, so I used to be a cameraman, used to work in TV, and I want to. I'll just bring up some video we can talk to as we go here. Let's talk about the broadcast. I was amazed at like the visual feast that was the ISA event. Action Sports Productions or something. I can't remember they kept saying the name of the firm that they used. It was phenomenal. Like
it was amazing.
There's been some really good stuff. I've seen some great coverage out of France. Obviously, I think the first time we had our minds blown in Qingdao by the ICF coverage, that was pretty amazing too. We'll come back to that because there's elements of this broadcast that didn't work as well, I think. But it was, in terms of the visuals, I'm just going to jump around, how this was covered, cameras on land, the drones, it just never felt like they were missing the action really.
It was, amazing.
It was incredible. That said, there was sort of a downside of sorts. And let me just preface this by saying that Bo and Shannon and Ben, I would watch them call a surf race like all day and forever. They're clearly pros, like clearly skilled at broadcast the whole nine, but they also clearly don't follow SUP as closely as Chris Parker, for instance. And we are really spoiled by having a couple of voices, Mathieu, Mike, who are very knowledgeable to various degrees about the sport. And when you've got folks who are really good at calling sporting events, but you're a giant paddle nerd like you and I are, it stands out like a sore thumb. Mike Euchre actually said something interesting, that he was watching the stuff with the events with his wife, who just noticed that they seemed very professional, and therefore she thought the coverage was good. I agree. These are people who understand television. They know how to tap in. I mean, all of it. It was like they're really good at that. But name pronunciation, calling the paddlers surfers. It was just like the cards were sort of like tilted a couple times. Your thoughts?
No, I mean, I defer to your knowledge of TV background on this, but you know, I agree with you, right? That like from a professional standpoint, blown away. They're throwing to camera A, B, C, D, E, F, G. They have a million different camera angles, and you really don't feel like you miss anything, right? And you get to see every part of the race and really get a sense of what conditions feel like. You can see facial expressions on people. You can feel the pain that they're in, and that's all incredible. But yeah, it does feel like, to your point, to bring up the example you're going to talk about, was back in 2019, the Qingdao ICF final. It's Chris Parker and Kelly Margetts calling the action.
It's amazing. It was so good.
They know, personally, almost every paddler out there. Even when you get back to place 64 or whatever, you know, Chris Parker could say like, oh yeah, that's so-and-so from this paddling community club in Europe that I've never heard of, right? But he knows that person because he said hey on the beach for a few minutes beforehand, or he went there, right? And so we get spoiled with that. But I do think
Margetts was amazing too. Like
amazing.
Straight shooting. He's sort of like retired out, so he doesn't care if he breaks a couple eggs here and there. But he was revealing stuff about the sport, like from a training standpoint, or even from a watching standpoint, sort of like where the moment of effort was for certain athletes and how you could tell when they were sort of applying more. I mean, it was amazing.
Yeah, you get more feel for the strategy and the game, right? And you and I talk about this all the time in our love for basketball too, right? That like, you've got a guy who knows TV and a guy who knows basketball calling all the games. Granted, there's some crossover in their expertise all the time, right? But for the most part, that's how it lines up. And that's how it was at that ICF race, which is why you and I were fawning over it, and still do, right? That like, Parker knows the sport and what people want to hear, and he brings the enthusiasm. He loses his goddamn voice on every thing that he ever... Yeah, it's amazing, right? And Kelly was an elite athlete and probably still is. I haven't heard or seen him paddle in a long time, but I bet he's still got some juice, right? So, but he can say, oh yeah, watch this person. They're probably going to try this at the next buoy because X, Y, and Z. So you get this insight into the sport that you wouldn't otherwise get. And I feel like those are the things that we missed a little bit.
Well, and it really jumped out. Yeah, it really jumped out when Candace got into the booth for the distance race.
Yes,
and
good point.
All of a sudden it was like that. No, so we dogged her a little for her taking it easy on the toe side turn, but she it was like a vocal backside turn executed perfectly when she was in the
Yes.
the booth. All this insight, just really kind of keeping the broadcast together and straight. It was great. And I will say this too. Bo, Shannon, and Ben all really, I'll say, you could tell they were learning
Yes.
through the week.
You could see it get better over the course of the week, which was awesome.
Yep. But that is an element I would love to see more, where we've kind of got it sorted out. We're sort of telling more of those stories about who the people are, why their training may have paid off, why they may not be able to do a toe side turn or a backside turn or that kind of stuff, and understanding like, oh, they don't get to train in, heavy water, or they do get to train in heavy, that kind of stuff that, Chris always had in abundance is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And when you're going number 15, who's number 15? Number 15 is going to make a turn now. And it's like, number 15's Nowick.
Right.
We know he's going to kill this turn. Like there's no, that kind of stuff. That was enough harping on that. Overall, A- for the full event from a broadcast perspective. The visuals were incredible. Ben Way, that dude speaks amazing.
Yeah.
I don't know how he's
languages.
not like. Why isn't he on NBC's Olympic team?
Yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
That's a great point. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Every time somebody from a different country comes up, he comes up and greets them in their language and then gives them the opportunity to speak what they can in English for some viewers, and then gives them say hey to your supporters back home from wherever it is that you're from. And it's just from the athlete standpoint, right? Like they see the investment and the comfort level, so you're going to get more out of that interview with them too. So I was blown away by him in particular. That was super cool.
Yeah. So
especially
room for
from
improvement.
A guy. Yeah.
Yeah, room for improvement, but kudos to the ISA for, I think, kind of
Amazing.
bringing the bar to another level. I mean, on a whole, it was wonderful to watch. And I frankly, as an enthusiast, I appreciate it. We were going to talk about the changing of the guard and the youth movement. I think we spent enough time talking about the youth of America. It hurts my feelings a little bit as a soon to be. I am a late 40s guy. I'm fully middle-aged. You're on your way. Okay, yeah. Let's talk about something that makes me happy. Some of our friends at Chattajack, pretty amazing race. That one I would love to. I don't know how you do it. I would love to see coverage of that with some really good storytelling.
Yeah,
it can be done. It can be done.
It could be done. There's cool footage of the Yukon River Quest, right? Like Parker did that whole movie a few years ago. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like a
the Screeching Eagle.
Yeah, kind of like a trippy documentary kind of thing he had going on there. That was pretty fun. But yeah, I think they tried a little bit of a live stream and a little bit of video back in 2019. It just didn't pan out. The race is long, right? The winning times for 14 foot for the men are generally somewhere around 5 hours, and the women's are generally a little behind that, but not much. Obviously, it depends on the year, but
yeah, you need to cover it like Ironman. You remember NBC used to do. I don't know if they still do. Yeah. It was Al Troutwig would cover the Kona Ironman. And it was so good. They would they'd boil it down to an hour. And it was just, they weren't even following the winners necessarily. They just picked a few people who they thought were going to be interesting storylines. And you would follow them through the thing. And of course they would nod their head to the winner. Jürgen from Germany wins, but you were still sort of rooting for the person who ultimately came in 14th.
Sure.
Who was, I think that's how you cover it. Kim Barnes and, who
John
was
Batson.
It? John? Yeah. John Batson, won.
John's been on the podium a bunch. I don't know how many times, but he's been chomping for that first place finish for a few years. So I was psyched to see him get one. And Kim, I believe she's won the race before a few times.
I think
maybe.
She has.
I could be wrong about that, but she won by a very wide margin, and I believe was second or third overall, just across the line on 14 foot boards total, which is super impressive. She killed it.
It is. And they're both, no kidding, about my age. They're not spring chickens. What is it? So you're the sports science guy. I mean, what does that say? We saw Shrimpy take out a pretty long distance race against two of the absolute best at the ISAs. Is there a youth advantage in that kind of distance, or is there just so much mental stuff going on that you still have an advantage as a more experienced athlete in a Chattajack 30-mile distance?
That's a great question. I think, two things. One, the distance race at the ISA and the distance that happens at Chattajack two totally different endeavors, right?
One's a tech compared to the other.
Yeah, the ISA race was ballpark 10 miles. So when you finish 10 miles, you're a third of the way at Chattajack, right? You got to do that 2 more times. And it's a crapshoot about what kind of conditions you get. There's been years where you have sun and it's tank tops and shorts and you've got a huge amount of current behind you, and before you know it, you're done. And other years where there's 30 miles an hour headwind and crashing waves over the bow of your board, and 7.5 hours later, you're done, right? Like, it's, who knows what's going to happen. So I do think the mental component is a really big part. So I think it's something not everybody knows is when you train for these ultra events, you don't go paddle ultras all the time in your training, right? You take it up to a certain amount, and then you just try to build your mental capacity and also your physical capacity to make sure that parts won't fall off. Because it's inevitable that at mile 27, shit hurts. There's nobody in that race who rolls around that big last left-hand turn at Chattajack. And if you've done the race, you know what I'm talking about. That turn goes on forever. I think the turn is actually like 2 miles long. It's terrible. But when you make it around that turn, you see Hales Bar Marina sticking out and you know you're going to make it, which is incredible. But it's such a mental endeavor, right? That like you have to just succumb to the fact that it is going to hurt. And it's going to hurt for a long time. But you have to know that everybody behind you and those in front of you also hurt. So it's just a matter of getting through that. And I think, back to your question, having experience is a huge part in that. And if you look at ultra athletes in almost every other sport, they're 30, 40 or more years old. You don't see a ton of teenagers or 20-somethings coming out and crushing ultra events. I think you haven't built up the aerobic capacity number of miles and hours in order to do that. And those older athletes can't compete in the sports that require a higher output anymore, right? Our hormones start to change or they kind of peak in our mid to late 20s, depending on your gender and exactly who you are. So I think that's why we see more of an older demographic at the longer and longer races.
Yeah. Yeah, well, kudos to Kim and John. Impressive. It's one of the great American races.
It is. Shout out to Ben and Kim who throw that race every year, because it's grown and grown and grown, and every year it goes off without a hitch. You never hear about something horrible or terrible happening from a safety standpoint or a logistics standpoint. Like, they somehow manage just shy of 1,000 people every fall, which is really incredible. And for them to have that same, there's no prize money at
for
Chattajack.
A 30-mile race, for a 30-mile. It's not like it's like, hey, let's float down the scenic river in some big city. It's Chattanooga, which is a cool town, but
it's an amazing thing that they pull it off. And have you done the race?
No, the 70-48 is my chosen sufferfest.
Oh, okay. Well, that's a great race. We'll have to get you down south to do the Chattajack one time. But it's
for a shorter race.
Yeah, right, for a warm-up for your 70-48. But, the community is amazing, and that really does start with Ben and Kim down there, that, like, people just come there for the community, too. The day before, when you see, I think I sent you the number. It's on here somewhere about exactly how many 14-foot boards were at this race.
230 14-foot boards.
Right. So when you're on the lawn,
12-6.
When you're on the lawn the night before looking at 350 boards laid out, it's a cool experience. You see friends you haven't seen for a long time. You meet new friends. You meet somebody out on the water that you feel like you're going to throw up next to, and you suffer through that, and it's a bonding experience, right? Like, it's a really cool thing. And to Chris Parker's point, we can have the Formula One and the Tour de France in our sport, right? There's a place for both things, and both things are really exciting. And this is the Tour de France, right? Like, it's a long slog that people eat up for whatever reason.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Yeah. Well, listen, I'll say it like I always do. Clearly, sub racing is alive and well. It feels like there's footing to be had. I'm very excited we're able to announce the national championship next November. That'll come together really well, I think. We've got some good folks at SoCal who are going to help pull that together in addition to the USA SUP board. Hey, man, it's always fun, man. Appreciate it.
Likewise, man. This is a blast. And for those listening, thank you. If you made it this far, we appreciate you even more.
What's wrong
than if
with
you
you?
started. Yeah, what's wrong with you? Get a life. So yeah, thank you. But it's always a blast talking with you, Adam. And I'm sure we'll find an excuse to do this again soon.
We will. See y'all.